We've sort of demonized and villainized addiction rather than understanding this protective role that it's playing.
And I really had to unpack the origin story of my eating disorder and recognize that at one point in time, it did serve a purpose. I started restricting my food intake, not as a way of losing weight, but really as a way of trying to stay safe and small. I conjured up this idea as a 12-year-old that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. It really conveyed this message that I couldn't convey on my own through words alone.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Untethering Shame. I'm your host, Kira Wackett, and today we're exploring a part of recovery that's rarely discussed, yet nearly universal: the middle place. When we think about recovery, whether from an eating disorder, trauma, or any other mental health challenge, we're often presented with two stark options: you're sick or you're recovered. But the reality is far more nuanced. Most people spend years in the space between acute illness and full recovery, a liminal middle place where progress and setbacks coexist. And yet, because of shame, the space often goes unnamed. Our guest today, Mallary Tenore-Tarpley, is shedding light on this overlooked reality. Mallary is an assistant professor of the University of Texas at Austin, teaching journalism and writing. Her debut nonfiction book, Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, weaves together her own story of anorexia, relapse, and healing with the voices of clinicians, researchers, and hundreds of people with lived experience. Mallary knows firsthand the weight of shame in recovery. After her mother died when she was 12, she developed anorexia and spent years in and out of hospitals and residential care. For over a decade, she hid the truth of her relapse, insisting that she was fully recovered, while silently battling cycles of restriction and binging. It wasn't until she reframed recovery, not as perfection, but as movement through slips, that she began to make meaningful progress. And that's what we're here to talk about today: what it means to slip without sliding. We'll unpack how shame turns setbacks into spirals, how to differentiate between a slip and a relapse, and why naming the middle place is so important, not just in eating disorder recovery, but in any healing journey that you're on. So let's dive in. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I know we were chatting a little bit offline, but I still go back to our initial conversation of, can you hear me? I'm in the car. I think I'm losing you. Here we are. Okay, we were going to do video, but we're not. We're doing this. And yet in the chaos of that entire conversation, how excited we both were and how much energy was flowing to get into this space together and to have this conversation.
Yes, it was such a memorable conversation, and I'm really excited to continue it here with video that's working.
Yes, right. All the tech in place and doing that, although I probably shouldn't say that because I feel like just when you feel like it's all working is when suddenly something goes off. But fingers crossed, knocking on wood that everything's good. Okay, I want to go straight into something here. I've had a lot of conversations with people about addiction, and having worked in the eating disorder field for many years, being in recovery from my own eating disorder, I know that I'm in it more, so I see it at a different level and lens than many people. But one of the things that I think the general population misses is that we've sort of demonized and villainized addiction rather than understanding this protective role that it's playing and really seeing that addiction and those patterns in our brain are often about either helping us escape from or escape to something that we are needing, longing for. And so I'm curious for you, just to use your story as an example, how do you see that framing into how your eating disorder played in your life?
Yes, that's such a great question. And it's something I thought about a lot when I was working on my book. And I really had to unpack the origin story of my eating disorder and recognize that at one point in time, it did serve a purpose. And unpacking that purpose really enabled me to have more empathy for my younger self, because my eating disorder began when I was 12, shortly after my mom had died of metastatic breast cancer. And she had been sick for about 3 years. And when she was sick, my father and I just always held on to hope that she was going to be okay. And so my parents and I really held on to this narrative that my mom was sick, but she was going to get better. She was a soldier in a battle. She was going to win that battle. We used to call her the little engine that could, and we'd say she's going to get over that mountain. And we continued to say that even after the cancer had metastasized to her bone marrow, her liver, and her brain. And as an adult, looking back on her medical records, which I obtained when I was working on the book, it was quite clear in looking at those records that she was not going to make it. But my parents really wanted to shield me from that reality. And so, because I was shielded from it, when my mother did pass away when I was 11, it felt like my whole world had crumbled, but I didn't know how to handle it. And so I did what I knew how to do best, which was to pretend that I was okay. And so I ended up going to school the day after my mom died. She died on a Sunday night. I went to school the following morning, walked there alone. My father just thought that it would be good if we went about our days, and he didn't want us to wallow in our sorrow. And I ended up writing the eulogy for her funeral and read it without crying. And I was praised for being strong and resilient. But behind that happy facade, I was so sad and did not know what to do with the weight of that sadness. And so everyone thought I was okay. But I found myself really wanting to stop time. I felt like the more time passed, the farther away I felt from my mom. And so this thinking coincided with this health class that I was taking at the time, where we were learning about quote unquote good foods and quote unquote bad foods. And we were weighed in front of our classmates. And I just was beginning to realize in the midst of this harmful messaging that I could control the way my body looked depending on what I ate or didn't eat. And so I conjured up this idea as a 12-year-old that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. And that's a very complex thought for a 12-year-old to have. Yeah. But I wrote about it in my journals, and I just was so intrigued by this idea of trying to stop time. And I really wanted to stay small. And so I started restricting my food intake, not as a way of losing weight, but really as a way of trying to stay safe and small. And once I began losing weight, my body spoke for me. People all of a sudden started to realize that Mallary needed help, and they realized maybe she's not okay. And so I ended up getting hospitalized when I was 13. And for a brief time, the eating disorder and those early hospitalizations did make me feel closer to my mom, because my most accessible memories of her were of her sick in a hospital bed, wasting away. In her records, it said that she was positive for anorexia, which just essentially means that she wasn't eating because of the illness. And so there I was, less than a year and a half later, in the hospital with an anorexia of my own. And so I felt closer to her because all of a sudden I was thrust back into this ecosystem of the hospital, and I was being cared for and given attention. But ultimately, the eating disorder stripped so much away from me and made me feel even farther away from my mother. But I had to also contend with what it did give me and the purpose it did serve, especially initially when it really conveyed this message that I couldn't convey on my own through words alone.
Well, and just thinking about how lonely at 11 years old and as you're turning 12, how lonely you were and how much you were longing for space to feel, to process, to communicate. I mean, you're right. That is an incredibly complex thought for, an adult to have, let alone an adolescent. And it just shows that you were working through so much and you didn't have a place to put it. And so you put it towards this actionable goal or next step. And then that tension point of it taking you out of your life, it causing such disruption, it causing such pain. And yet it's the one way that you can be close in this deep seated way to your mom, who you just wanted to be with and you wanted to process your grief around. And so also what a distraction I can imagine against dealing with some of those things too, of now the focus is on something completely different and you're still longing for the grief part, but now everybody's focused on you in an entirely different way. And so what was Dad's response in all of that, considering Dad's messaging up till that point had been, we're okay. We're going to keep going. Everything is fine. And then suddenly my daughter's not fine. What was his response to you?
So he was very perplexed by it. He did not understand what was happening. He knew that something was wrong, but he really didn't know much at all about eating disorders, understandably. This was the late 90s, and his only point of reference for eating disorders was the death of singer-songwriter Karen Carpenter, who had died in 1983 due to complications from anorexia. And so he was under the impression that only adults struggled with anorexia. And so he didn't think that that's what it was that I was struggling with. And I had learned about eating disorders in 17 magazine, which my father had bought me a subscription to after my mom died because he thought it might hold answers to womanly questions that I might have. And the first issue I ever read actually had a cover story that was titled Girls Who Exercise Themselves to Death. And it was all about eating disorders. And so in reading that story and in hearing about eating disorders in health class, I was under the impression that people with anorexia didn't eat anything at all. And I was still eating, not nearly enough, but I was still eating. And I thought, well, I mustn't be anorexic because I'm eating. And so my father had taken me to the pediatrician because, again, he knew something was wrong, but he was hoping for answers. And the pediatrician was not able to provide any sort of counsel. He essentially said that my weight loss was a passing phase. And so I was sent home. And then 6 months later, I was taken again to the pediatrician, who told me and my father once again that it was just a passing phase that I would grow out of. And so we were really at the hands of a doctor who did not know what was wrong or how to diagnose me. And so finally, my father had consulted a family friend who was a nurse who said that she thought I likely had an eating disorder and recommended Boston Children's Hospital in Massachusetts, where I grew up. And so my father promptly called them, took me to the ER, and I was admitted that night and got the diagnosis of anorexia. And so it was a really circuitous path to a diagnosis in the sense that it was hard to find help for me. And I talked with my father when I was working on the book just to get a better sense of why he sent me to school and why he didn't share hard truths with me about my mom's illness. And he really saw it as a protective mechanism and thought that being strong meant not crying, because he thought, well, if I started crying, then I was afraid you would start crying and we'd both be sitting on the couch crying our eyes out. And I recognize as a parent where he was coming from, but that experience has also shaped my own views as a woman in recovery and as a parent. And I think that oftentimes hard truths are our best armor, and they can expose us to just so many more life lessons than sugar-coated truths ever can.
Yeah, but you can appreciate that not only as a parent, but from sort of a patriarchal society and masculinity and toxic masculinity, that it wasn't just how do I be strong for my kid, but this is what men are supposed to be like and how they're supposed to respond. And I have to be strong for my family. And so the pressure that he had coming into this and his own narrative that was already rooted in his own negative core beliefs and concepts and getting passed on to you. And then you're dealing with this, but you're kind of like, I'm okay. But also, you're not. But what you really need is still getting missed. You're still not being seen. You're still sort of on the surface being looked at. You're like, nope, everything is fine, which plays into this a little bit too. At the time that you went to the hospital, did you get to a place where you're like, no, I'm not okay? Or were you still operating under the assumption, I'm fine because I'm still eating, I'm still doing this, everyone's making a big deal out of it, I should just be able to be at home?
So once I was hospitalized, I in some ways felt this huge sense of relief because I knew all along that something was not okay. And I really wanted some sort of help. I was afraid of it because I was afraid that if I got help, it would mean I would need to start eating and stop exercising. But in some ways, being in that hospital was this permission slip to just eat and to rest. I remember feeling the weight of the comforter in the hospital bed and just feeling this huge sense of relief that I didn't have to sort of get up and move around or run or do all these exercises I'd been doing at home. And so I think once I was discharged from the hospital that first time, I did try to pretend that I was fine, and I was just trying to be sneaky about eating and other things, because I wanted to just fall back into the disorder once I got out of the hospital. So sometimes I would put up a front in that sense. But my father, to his credit, was beginning to learn about eating disorders and was beginning to recognize those patterns in me, and continued to try to get me help as I got caught in this revolving door of being hospitalized, getting sent home, being hospitalized again.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like that's often a thing that's not talked about either. So first, it's understanding that people don't wake up and go, like, I would have this conversation with my mom. My mom struggled with a crack cocaine addiction and other medications, drugs, things like that, alcohol. And then I had an eating disorder. And she and I both have talked over time and in our recovery about how none of us woke up and went like, boy, I really want to, do crack cocaine. I really want to be in a drug house. I really want to be sitting over my toilet throwing up right now, or counting every calorie on 10,000 Post-it notes to know when I'm allowed to eat again and how much I can have. Like, nobody wakes up going, this feels fun. This feels like I'm going to get what I need from this. It is the desperate attempt of someone who is vulnerable and longing and in pain, that they find something that does give an initial dopamine hit. It does give them something that then they go, all right, let's try this. This is better than the other thing. And then over time, it's just such a conditioned response that you probably were going through the motions and like doing the things of recovery, and you were in a different place. And then you'd get home and that longing, those needs, those like underlying pieces were still there, on top of the fact that now your brain had this wiring that response was always going to be more accessible now because it had been fine-tuned. And so you come in and out, and if we haven't yet dealt with everything underneath, the eating disorder is going to be right there waiting, like your really bad best friend that's always got the bad ideas. And you're like, well, fuck it. Let's go joyride down a hill together without seatbelts on and sit on top of the car and do whatever. Like, sure, it'll probably be fine. It's better than this feeling that I have. And so you talked about this period of time and this sort of back and forth, and a lot of the messaging that you were wanting to have people see you as being fully recovered, and you were kind of doing this. Was that more so that you could protect and continue to do the eating disorder behaviors? Like, you just wanted to figure out how to fall back in line? Or was it, I just need everybody to think I'm okay, and I've got to perform better, and I've got to button it up more, and kind of that same piece that led into you going to school the day after your mom passed away?
It was more of the latter, where I really felt like I should have been better than I was. And this was after I had been hospitalized on 5 separate occasions. And then I was in residential treatment for a year and a half, which is an almost unheard of length of time these days. But I was really fortunate in that my Department of Mental Health in Massachusetts and my school system paid for my treatment. So that's the only reason I was able to stay for that long. But after so many years of treatment, I felt like I really needed to achieve this gold standard of full recovery. And it's what my treatment team had been pushing for. And yet no one had ever really defined what that meant for me. And so in my mind, I equated it with this perfectionistic ideal. And when I got out of residential treatment, I went immediately back to school my junior year of high school and just was determined to get all A's and join all the extracurriculars that I could. And I did. And for 2 years, I excelled. And I thought, well, if this is what full recovery looks like, I must be getting an A plus, because I was trying to eat just the right amount and exercise just the right amount and do everything I could to succeed academically. And the pressure of that felt so insurmountable. And I was afraid that if I made one wrong move, I would very quickly slide back into dangerous territory again and get sick and once again land in the hospital. And so I was really petrified of slipping. And then when I was a freshman in college, I ended up falling into this cycle of binge eating and restricting, which lasted for over a decade. And it was really during that decade that I held on to this full recovery narrative, in part because I didn't exactly know what was happening. I had never before binged prior to that freshman year in college. And so binging made me feel like I was failing at anorexia and failing at full recovery. and I was really ashamed of the binge eating. And so that would play out the night or the day after a binge where I would just restrict. And it was this pattern I could not get out of. And I didn't recognize or know at the time that it's very common for this diagnostic crossover, as it's called, to occur, where people who have struggled with anorexia go on to develop these binge eating habits and behaviors. But I think I wanted to just portray myself as someone who had conquered my disorder and who had overcome it, because as a perfectionist, I had a lot of trouble contending with the reality that I hadn't overcome it. And so I was really leading this double life where I was sharing this fully recovered narrative to the outside world, but then going back to my dorm or my apartment and just secretly devolving into the disorder and engaging in disordered behaviors and then having disordered thoughts and not knowing who to talk to about that. So it was very much this silent struggle that I was ashamed of and that I didn't really know how to grapple with, or didn't even have a name for. I wouldn't have said at the time that I had relapsed, even though looking back now, it was clear that I had.
Well, and it's interesting too to see the dynamics play out where when your mom was sick, the narrative that was given to you and to the world is all this hope and she's going to get better and she's fine. She's doing great. Look at this. Well, underneath she is crumbling. And to her too, there were probably moments that had to be really lonely for her, because even though they were trying to do this for you and for everything else, she wasn't seen in that, in her pain, in her dying process, because it was so much about a certain presentation in the world. And then for you to be playing that same piece out where I need everyone to think I'm okay. I need to be past this. It's been too much time. I'm stronger than this. I'm better than this. And those same stories coming into you, essentially showing the world, look, I'm good. I got this. I've got the A's. I've got these things. Like, I'm better, while you are moving further and further away from what better would be for you. Not the fully recovered gold star that we all were like, we somehow can get here, even though we now both know that's not true. But the idea of that, whatever was needed, wanted, longing for, you kept moving further away from that because you were constantly living in this detached state from your actual emotional self and what was going on. And so I can't imagine how that pressure felt for you, where again, everything is all or nothing. You're doing it right or wrong, good or bad. And so I just need, obviously I am bad, I can't do it, but I need the world to think I can. And that piece that's a very scary place to be in that moment.
It is. Yeah. And I really appreciate you drawing that parallel between how my mother must have felt and how I felt at the time. No one else has really made that parallel before, but I think it's very on point because I can imagine that it must have been really lonely for my mom, just realizing that she likely wasn't going to make it and yet having to project this sense of strength and courage. And I felt very much the same way, even though I was grappling with a different disorder and disease. I felt like I needed to be strong and I needed to just be better than I was. And that was a very lonely place to be because I felt so misunderstood. I remember at one point I was at a work retreat and there were these Hershey Kisses on the table, and a colleague had offered me a Hershey Kiss, and I was considering taking one, but another colleague interjected and said, "Are you crazy? Mallary would never eat a Hershey Kiss. She's a healthy eater," because this colleague had gotten used to seeing me eat these healthy foods, so to speak. And I just thought, oh my gosh, in that moment, it was such a recognition of how my disorder would just dismantle all of my desires, because of course I wanted a Hershey Kiss, but I thought I have a reputation to uphold. I can't have one. But then that night, as I was driving home from the retreat, I stopped at the grocery store and bought a big bag of Hershey Kisses and inhaled every single one in my apartment alone at night. And so it was just this example of all of these times where people thought that I was this image of perfection or strength or health. And if only they knew what it was like to just peel or peer back the curtain on my life, they would have seen a very different version of me.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because I often feel like if there's a spectrum of 0, meaning I've never had a negative thought about my body, I've never felt bad about eating food, I've never had any feelings like I should look this way, that way, whatever. That's 0. I don't know a single person who's ever been there. I don't think that's a human experience. And then there's the maybe let's say 95 to 100. And that's the people that get these clinical diagnoses. There's a 1 to 94 on the scale that we don't talk about around disordered eating and disordered relationships with our body. And then what is interesting is I feel like once you've reached that 95 to 100, the only option is that you live there or at 0. There's no discussion that the rest of the fucking world lives in the 1 to 94. And to be a normal, healthy, functioning human, you're going to fall in the 1 to 94. And I remember having a conversation with one of my therapists being like, well, this isn't fair. So what you're essentially telling me is I can never want to diet. I can never want to lose weight. I can never feel like I need to go work out again for any of the wrong reasons. It couldn't possibly be about how I look physically. I shouldn't care what I look like physically. I can't change my clothes more than one time a day because that means I'm getting fixated on my body. I can't dislike a picture or want to delete it again. What the fuck? The rest of the world can do that, and we have considered that normal. But what you're saying is, and my takeaway was always, I wasn't controlled and strong enough to stay at 94. I should have been able to stay in that 94. I fucked up and got to 95, and I lost the privilege of living in the 1 to 94. And it feels like that connects so much to your experience and the work that you're doing, talking about the middle place and this idea of recovery and where we exist and what we need to talk about in that scope.
Yes. Yeah. What you said reminds me of this really interesting research that I came across called normative discontent. And it's this kind of clunky term to describe the fact that research shows that the vast majority of men and women in our society have some level of discontent with our bodies to the point where it's more the norm than the exception. And so I remember thinking about that and just having this moment of realizing that it's a really hard society to recover into. And so to think that we're going to recover from an eating disorder and never have a bad body image day or never have these moments that feel very fraught when we're making decisions around food is pretty unrealistic in our society. And it's also just really not fair for us to feel like we have to be better, right? That we have to be in that 95 to 100% category, because that's not the reality for most of us living in a body in today's society. And so I think we need to give ourselves more grace for that, because for so long I thought, well, I'm not supposed to have any bad thoughts about my body because I'm supposed to be fully recovered. And so when those thoughts did creep in, they felt, one, intrusive, but they also felt very off limits. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not supposed to have those thoughts. What is wrong with me?
Yes.
And now I realize that it is normal to have those thoughts, as harmful as they can be or as intrusive as they can feel.
And recognizing that most of our existence is on some form of a spectrum. We could talk about, as I got recovered from my eating disorder, and then I realized I had a lot of trauma to work through, and I worked through my interpersonal dynamics and my relationships, and now being a mom, my shame will find something new to hop to. It's a very exploitive emotion that looks for anything. It's very opportunistic. And so now it lands on I'm a shitty mom all the time. And it's the same when I get stuck there. It's the same experience. It's the 0 or the 95 to 100. I'm either an amazing mom or I'm a shit mom. There's no in between. And the only way that I can ever get somewhere close is the comparative piece, which we also know is not healthy, because living in a culture of constant comparison is only going to leave all of us stuck in those negative headspaces and engaging in those behaviors, whether it's the eating disorder around now we are fixated on what our body looks like and we're nitpicking everything. And this person has a better collarbone. This person has better definition in their muscles. This person looks better in that one swimsuit that I also own, whatever that might be. And then when it comes to being a parent, it might be a reflection of how our kids are showing up or how we feel like we respond to our kids. And there's constantly some jump that happens. And so why is this research important, and is this conversation important on a global level, not just for people with eating disorders? Why do we need to be talking about the middle place? Why do we need to be talking about this concept of a slip versus relapse? Why is this important, not again, just as eating disorder recovery, but from a cultural shift and a framework of really thinking about humanity from a much more flexible and graceful place?
Yes. So I have felt like there are so many examples of how the middle place can play out. And I really have explored it primarily through the lens of eating disorders. But as I've talked with readers who've read my book, I've recognized that the middle place can be a really helpful framework for thinking about grief and loss and addiction, and the middle place between knowing something's wrong and getting an actual diagnosis. I mean, there's so many of these middle places. And for me, it was incredibly helpful to reframe my thinking around what I call the middle place, because at the time, after about 10 years of cycling in and out of binging and restricting, I started working for this small nonprofit where I was tasked with helping journalists tell what we called restorative narratives. And these were stories that show how people and communities make meaningful progress forward in the aftermath of trauma or tragedy or illness. And I was teaching journalists how to tell these stories and encouraging them to embrace messy middles. And it occurred to me that that could actually be a really helpful way of thinking about my own recovery. And I thought, what would it mean to actually see myself not as someone who's fully recovered, but as someone who is working through this middle place and who can slip sometimes, but then also find ways of getting back up again. And so I began to toy with this idea that maybe embracing imperfections in recovery could in fact help me to make that meaningful progress forward. And so I began to think more about this middle place. And as I did, I started to give myself permission to slip. And rather than demonizing every slip and then letting it turn into a slide, I would say, okay, I just slipped. I recognize that that is going to be part of my recovery. Why did I slip? And how can I work on getting back up now? Not tomorrow or next week once I'm past my deadlines, but how do I work on getting back up now? And that also prompted me to then go back into therapy, because I, for that 10-year cycle, was not seeing a therapist because I didn't want anyone to think that there was anything wrong. But embracing this idea of the middle place made me realize that in order to get back up from those slips, I needed to be able to talk with someone who I trusted about the slips and work through those. And so I began to then recognize that it was okay if I slipped, and that oftentimes those slips were happening when I was actually trying to make choices in service of recovery. Because if you think about that word slip, the etymology of that word comes from Middle English, from a word called slippin, which means to move forward softly. And I think that's such a beautiful way of thinking about slips, because often we slip when we are trying to move forward softly in service of recovery, because you can't slip if you're standing still. And so I began to sort of give myself more grace when I slipped, and also recognize that the slips and the progress could coexist. And so as I began to think about that with regard to my eating disorder, I also was thinking about it with regard to my grief and loss, because an important part of my own recovery was learning how to grieve the loss of my mother. And I recognized that even with grief, I'm in a middle place, because my mom has been gone for almost 30 years now, but I've never arrived at this place of closure, just as I've never arrived at a place of full recovery from my eating disorder. I still carry the load of that loss, but it has lightened over time, just as I have made progress over time in the middle place with my eating disorder. And so I see a lot of parallels there between the disorder and between the grief and loss. And I think that this middle place framework really is important in the context of eating disorders, because so many people who struggle with eating disorders share similar temperament traits, and perfectionism is one of them. Black and white thinking is one of them. And so in some ways, it's ironic that the eating disorder field has has really talked about recovery and sickness in very black and white terms. And so if we can allow more space for nuance and for the gray, messy middles, I think we can really make people in this space feel more seen and heard. And we can help them to recognize that they can still work toward living a full life, even if they haven't reached the gold standard of full recovery. So there's lots more to unpack there, but for me, it's been incredibly helpful to be in this middle place. And I've been in this middle place for a while, but I continue to try to move forward. It's not about settling for stagnancy, but trying to make progress, knowing that I've not reached any sort of finish line, but I'm continuing to work toward more recovery day by day.
Well, and I've been having a lot of conversations lately with people as we do inner child work or internal family systems work. And we talk a lot about the different parts that are developed. And if I break it down very simply, before we get into naming all the different parts, we'll kind of hit at 3 pieces we know are a part of the puzzle right now. You as the adult version of you, the inner child version of you that had that wound or a series of wounds and longing and is vulnerable, and then the protective part that was developed to make sure that that inner child part never feels that pain again, is not seen, it's not exposed. I'm going to do whatever it takes to help make sure that I show up. It's like the big brother. And I feel like oftentimes what we forget, and I was just having this conversation with a client today, when it's, how do I get to this perfect point where I'm never reactive with my mom again? How do I get to this perfect point where I never engage in eating disorder behavior again? You're trying to control the future without recognizing that human existence is full of triggers. I still think about when I was in and I would lead groups. I did intensive outpatient groups before I worked in a residential and a partial hospitalization program. And we get into these groups, and a lot of my training early on was around how to avoid triggering people in the room. And maybe 6 months after I graduated and had my master's, I was like, well, this is fucking dumb. This is not helping people because they're going to leave here and be triggered. So what do I do knowing this person's going to go home and their stepmom is still going to heat up their lean cuisine and not eat the same meal as everybody else and talk about her calorie counting? It's not helpful that I'm not letting somebody else talk about how they want a calorie count right now for this person who actually needs to work through this trigger. And one of the things that I think is helpful is for us to remember that inner child wound is a part of us. We can help heal it. We can move through it in a different way so it's not so raw and painful. But because that wound is a part of us, the protective part is always there too. And if we can establish trust with that protective part, like, hey, I've got them, that inner child part. I'm going to give them what they needed, what they didn't get. I'm going to give them the permission to not be perfect. I'm going to give them permission to fuck up, to be vulnerable, whatever it is. If we can build trust with them, they go, okay, cool. I'm just here if you need me. And they are much quieter. But when we prove to the protective part that they can't trust us to give us what we needed, they're like, you're out. Tap out, dude. I'm here. And now I'm going to come in because you showed me I can't trust you. And I'm not willing to roll the dice and wait around for you to decide that your inner child is worth taking care of. And I feel like that conversation, that dynamic, that iterative process is the recovery, is the healing. And so I'm going to be triggered again. I was years into my recovery and then I got pregnant and I was like, I should probably see a therapist. This is going to be a new deal. Like, not just gaining weight, but how I show up for my body is different. What it looks like is different for me. How I want to talk about food in front of my daughter. As I get older, as I realize I can't control the world around my kid, and I have to process the fact that death is something that I am seeing in such a different level now. And I'm aware that my time with her is finite. And I feel that fear. And every time I fuck up, I go again to that 0 and 100 scale. And that protective part goes, I'm here if you need me. So when I can't give myself grace, that fucking jar of Nutella looks really great to binge on to get a little dopamine hit to escape the fear. And then the next day I'm going to restrict to show, nope, I got it. Don't worry. We won't let that vulnerability seen. The inner child is safe. And that dynamic and your language that you provide is something that I feel like had I had that at 18, 19, when my eating disorder was really bad, I would have been able to carry more grace. I think I still would have cycled. I don't think my perfectionistic brain would have been like, well, that's great. I like this approach right away. But it would have softened the landing a bit. It would have made me feel like that was the goal more than the standard that I had developed and I had reiterated to me that I could meet in all these other places. So I couldn't figure out why I couldn't meet it here in recovery. And I love that you are taking the wind out of the sails of that piece that so many of us with eating disorders, again, whether it's in our eating disorder or not, we are on that ride all the time.
Exactly. And yet we're not talking about it nearly enough. I mean, I think it's so important to have conversations like this one about the middle place because you are someone who really understands it. And there are so many people who live in this place, but who feel ashamed. They feel like they have to be silent about it.
Yeah.
And it's partly because within the eating disorder field, we tend to use these terms of quasi recovery or pseudo recovery. And those are terms to describe people who maybe were in treatment and got better, but are still engaging in some eating disorder behaviors. And I think that those terms can be really pernicious because I remember when they were first introduced to me, I remember thinking, well, it makes me feel like I'm faking my recovery or that my recovery is somehow not real. And even when I was telling people that I was working on the book, some people would say, oh, the middle place, do you mean like quasi recovery or pseudo recovery? And I said, no, I said, I don't want us to use those terms anymore. I want us to just embrace this idea that we can be in a middle place where we are working really hard on recovery. So it's not for lack of trying. And yet we still are living with aspects of the disorder, or the disorder still remains a vulnerability. And I ended up surveying over 700 people from around the world with eating disorders when I was working on the book. And 85% of them said that they could identify with this middle place. And so I thought, okay, this place is quite populous, and yet we're not talking about it enough. And I think part of just the fact that, you know, we've not talked about it very much is due to the fact that there hasn't really been a name for it. I think there's a lot of power in naming something because then you create momentum around it, you create conversation around it. And so I think that for a lot of people who have lived in this middle place, it has felt like this wordless place. And so that's contributed to their kind of just inability to really feel safe talking about it. And so I think the more we can talk about it, the better, because especially if we can even talk with people who we love and trust about the middle place and say, hey, like I'm in this middle place, it then gives us more permission to actually be able to talk about our slips. Because if we are saying that we're fully recovered and yet we're actually not, then it becomes so much harder to talk about slips, because then people will react in such a way that will make you feel more ashamed. They might say, well, I thought you were all better. Like, what's going on? Or why are you grappling with this? Whereas if we let people know we're in this middle place, we're trying to move forward, but it's hard and we are sometimes slipping, then we can just verbalize those slips more and feel also more empowered to ask for the kind of support that we need. I, for instance, talk with my husband about my slips, and I let him know, I don't want you to lecture me. I just want you to listen to me with compassion and curiosity. And so I just think that there's a lot of value in being able to name something, and also empowering people to just be able to define recovery on their own terms. One of the things that I think is really powerful about the middle place is it allows just for more inclusivity in terms of how we talk about recovery. Because if we're only talking about recovery in its fullest expression, and we're only publishing books about people who are fully recovered, or we're only giving speaking opportunities to people who are fully recovered, then it can make those of us in the middle place feel a lot more invisible. And it can make us feel like our own recovery stories are not validated, or they're not worthy of being shared. And so if we can talk more freely about the middle place, I think it just then opens up more avenues for storytelling, for inclusivity, and also for messiness. I mean, it's hard to talk about messiness, but I think that that's where a lot of growth happens, when you kind of lean into that messiness and explore it.
I love that. Yeah, I think a lot about what you just named that's also helpful is once there's a specific diagnosis, name, term, whatever it is, you also allow the opportunity for community to be built. And so that loneliness that exists where we're like, what the fuck? Why can't I be like that person on the book cover? Why can't I be like that person in 17 magazine? I should be able to do this. Other people are doing this. We don't realize that's the minority. And probably even of those people, only a minority of them are even actually in that place. Most of them are probably just in the middle. They're just better at performing around it, or they've gotten better at being quiet. So when you go, oh, this is a place that other people are at, I have community in that. Maybe I am actually not broken. Maybe this is normal. And that slight shift also allows us to recognize it and I think have a little bit more grace. And that's because we've often created this suffer in silence mentality. And for many people with eating disorders, that perfectionistic, on the grind, we are doers and we are often the people that have absorbed all the doing for everybody else. We're not going to offload our shit to other people. And so this is my shit to sort out and deal with. This is my stuff to make better. Once you name this, I might go, oh, maybe this is actually where I'm going to be. Like maybe I did make it. I'm at exactly where I'm supposed to be. And the shift that you described sounds like almost releasing this idea that we have to be a product that we put out into the world in our final version. More we're a process and we can allow people in that process. One thing I can imagine that comes up, because people love to critique and they love to, dump on anything. Some people are going to assume that the middle place also creates this opportunity that we can say, well, I'm here and there's a slip. I'm just going to call it a slip. Actually, they are sliding. Actually, they are relapsing. And there's sort of this, how do we tease apart that when we're avoiding, when we're detaching, when we're maybe using the middle place against our own recovery, when our eating disorder brains, our protective parts have manipulated it in a way, versus when we're genuinely there? What do we do with that piece?
I think it's a really important question to ask ourselves because it can be easy to just kind of settle in the middle place and not necessarily think about moving forward. It also can be easy to say, well, I just slipped, right? As opposed to recognizing that it actually was something more serious than that. And I mean, one thing that I like to do is just think about the difference between a slip, a lapse, and a relapse. And so I think about a slip as an unplanned one-time deviation from kind of your recovery plan or your treatment plan. And you may not necessarily have a formalized plan, right? But you have goals in your recovery. And so a slip is sort of a deviation from those goals or your values in recovery. Whereas a lapse is typically a more significant engagement in eating disorder thoughts and behaviors over an extended period of time. And then a relapse is a repetitive pattern of eating disorder thoughts and behaviors with an inability to get back on track. So you're not able to get back up and move forward at all. There were some eating disorder treatment programs who I consulted when I was working on the book, and some treatment centers also use the term collapse, which is sort of a worsening relapse that requires high levels of care. And so I think it's important to be able to think about what each of those terms means for you, and to really be mindful of the fact that slips can lead to lapses and a relapse if we're not intentional about, one, talking about those slips, and two, figuring out how to get back up. And so part of what can be really helpful is not just fixating on the slips, but really recognizing the times when you get back up and celebrating small victories. Because when we lose sight of those small victories and the moments when we've been able to get back up, then it's easier to just be thinking about slips and then sliding. And so one thing I've done, for instance, is I try to create visuals of these small victories. And there was a time where every time I would get back up from a slip, I would make a little origami heart, because I've done origami origami for years. I first learned how to do it when I was in the hospital. And I would make a little origami heart, and then I would stick it in this mason jar on my desk. And over time, that mason jar would get higher and higher with these origami hearts. And I could sort of look at that as a reminder of all the times when I was able to get back up. And so I think if we can recognize those moments, celebrate those moments, visualize them, that can then sort of, in some ways, motivate us to keep moving forward. But if we find ourselves in the situation where we're not able to recognize any moments of growth, or we're not able to get back up at all from those slips, then that could be a sign that we are sliding back into the eating disorder, or that we may end up needing, a different level of care. So I think being in the middle place can be a very vulnerable place to be. And it requires a lot of vigilance around where we're at and around how much progress, if any, we're making. And the goal, I always say, in the middle place is to keep moving forward. And to keep aiming for more recovery. That may be very minimal one day, it may be a little bit more the next day, but it's this idea that we're trying to move forward, because the middle place is not a fixed state. It's very much a fluid state.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think listeners, for us to think about that with anything, I even think about that with, we've talked about this on the show before, that a lot of my shame will fixate on whether it's being a good parent, the judgment of what my house would look like. If I go to my weightlifting class, how heavy am I lifting versus what I did last week, or other people? There's so many ways that we can build that all or nothing, and these standards where we're constantly expecting ourselves to be moving forward with no side steps, step backs, and at a pace and rate that is consistent all the time. And that is not what it looks like. That is not what life looks like. And so I'm just even imagining the days where I'm like, all right, I'm a shitty mom, I really fucked up. Like, can I go back and think about a day that I did something really good, or that I'm proud of myself for? Can I acknowledge, can I put a little tick mark down of, in this instant, you did this thing that's actually really awesome? Or what does it mean for you to have maybe handled something poorly, and then you still apologized and owned it with your daughter? That's a really big deal. Many people that in your life would struggle to do that with you. And that was a big thing you were longing for, was for someone to share in accountability, or have their own sort of accountability platform that they could be on. And so I think about that as it relates to all these pieces. Particularly, I remember when I was doing a partial hospitalization program, I was running groups there. We would talk about stoplights, and that was their framework, was always yellow light, green light, yellow light, red light. And people would be like, what about when it's orange? What about when it's like yellow, green? There's more places to stop. And so it's interesting, because I feel like people were longing for this terminology and this process before we had it, and we were trying to create it. But now you've given us a framework that, as practitioners, as people in recovery, as the general public, we can share in the language model that helps create more open doors for conversation. And so thinking about this as people are walking away, there's going to be, I guess, technically 3 avenues of people listening to this. There's going to be people with an eating disorder, or in their eating disorder recovery process. There's going to be practitioners. And then there's going to be the general pop. And they're all coming in and they're like, okay, I might know someone that's in one of those other 2 fields, but I'm just kind of here and I'm existing in this space. Is there sort of a universal message that you would want them all to walk away with, to allow that cohesive communication and community building to happen in a way that ultimately comes back and supports these individuals that are struggling and have often felt so alone?
So I would say that it's really important to just talk more about this middle place and hold space for conversations around it, so that people existing in this place can ultimately move forward in their recovery. I think the fact that we don't talk about it makes people just end up settling for stagnancy or sliding back into dangerous territory. And so I think particularly for clinicians, that's important too, because one of the things I always talk about is how the middle place and having conversations about the middle place doesn't negate the possibility of full recovery. I mean, I have spoken with many individuals who identify as being fully recovered. And so that can be a possibility. And so it's important to recognize that just because we talk about the middle place doesn't mean that we still can't talk about full recovery, right?
Yeah.
You can have conversations about both. And so I would just encourage people to recognize that, and also to just be able to speak truth to where you really are, and to think about how can you tell the most authentic narrative about your recovery and where you're at. Because when we have a disconnect between that narrative we share with the world and the one that we live out behind closed doors, it can really create this crisis of identity and make it so hard for us to actually make progress. I think about this a lot in terms of eating disorder clinicians who I've talked to who feel as though they're actually in the middle place, but have to portray this ideal of full recovery because they don't want to make it seem as though they're disqualified, right? If they're still grappling with aspects of their disorder. And so I recognize that talking about the middle place may not necessarily feel safe for everyone to do publicly. But I think even if we can talk with one person or talk with ourselves about the middle place, it then frees us up to be able to think about kind of what that means and what recovery can look like for us now and moving forward. So yeah, I would just encourage everyone to embrace more of that language around it, and to just come up with the words that make sense to you when you think about your recovery and your goals for moving forward.
Well, and I can attest that as a therapist working with people, I wasn't allowed to share any part of my story when I worked at the partial hospitalization program. It was a very interesting place, very different values than how I come to see people and also recovery. But prior to that, in the clinics that I was in, working in intensive outpatient and outpatient settings, and even now, I firmly believe that self-disclosure helps support the nuance when you can use it appropriately. Obviously, if you're coming in as the therapist and you're like, well, let me tell you about me, and ultimately it becomes about you, we got a few other issues. But I have found that for the clients that I've worked with, one, when I would be the lead at meals, I could call out, like, I know what you're doing. I know exactly why you're doing what you're doing. I've done this. It's okay. And we both know that this is not just I'm full or I'm this. There's something else happening here. So one, we could have that call out more openly. But two, I could say, I still struggle. There are still days that I don't quite know if I'm ordering a salad because I genuinely want the salad, or if it's because they posted the nutrition information and now I can't unsee it. And I'm unable to order the burger that I kind of wanted when I walked in here. I don't know. And sometimes it probably is entirely disordered. And that sucks. And it sucks to feel like we can never want these things. And when I could do that for people in the right context, it normalized this person that they saw as having it together, or at least more together than them. Oh, she's only there. She's at this point and she's doing good. She's telling me how to be okay. Probably that's more accessible. And so I will say to clinicians listening to this, again, you can work with people with eating disorders, even if you haven't had one, and you can be amazing. I have met many clinicians that never struggled. For those of you that have struggled, even if you didn't struggle with that 95 to 100, but you're like, man, I've lived at the 50%. I've been the Diet Coke and the Jenny Craig and the whatever in my past lives too. It's okay to talk about that. That does help make those pieces more accessible and normalize that getting to a place of recovery in our culture is really hard. And so all of this to say, as someone who works in the field and as someone in recovery, I'm so grateful for your book. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity you're giving people to reframe how they show up, how they help, how they build community, how we reflect ourselves, and also how we ask questions. And thinking about that, how can other people listening, whether that's for themselves, maybe they buy it for their clinic, They've got friends that are therapists. They're handing them out at all of the recovery centers. That would be the goal, is as you're leaving, everybody gets a book to take with them. Where do they go to get their hands on Slip?
So I would love for your listeners to get their hands on it, because I do hope that it will be really helpful for them, and they can find it wherever you buy books. So it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, local independent bookstore, Target.com, various places. And yeah, it's a book that I really just hope will have a positive impact on people and on the field, and just really appreciate your interest in it. It means a lot.
Oh, of course. And so now my last question to you is for future you, because we've talked about you 11, 12, moving through this, all that you've learned, all that you've witnessed, all the going back. Now I want you to imagine you a year from now. And maybe you're at a different point in the middle place. We don't know where. We don't know how far you'll be. Maybe you're further towards fully recovered. Maybe you'll have slipped. Wherever you're at, what do you want that Mallary to hear and to hold, regardless of where she finds herself in her recovery process?
That's a beautiful question. I would like her to know that she is really courageous. I think in some ways it's an act of courage to say publicly that you're in the middle place. And I have found that to be true myself, especially in a society that really prefers stories with protagonists who prevail. And so to just really be honest about being in the middle place, being in recovery, I think can feel very scary, but it also is courageous. And I think about my mom trying to be courageous, and sometimes it was hard to know, what does that actually mean? But I feel like I have a much clearer definition of what it means now. And I hope that I can continue to embrace that courage. And I especially think about that just in terms of where I'm at in my life and where I'll be a year from now, because I'm at the point where I have just turned 40 and have just outlived my mother. My mom was 40 when she passed away. And so I'm thinking a lot about, what does it look like over this next year to be at this place in my life where I'm beginning to outlive my mom and experience this phase of life that she never got to live. And so I'm really thinking about, how do I embrace that courage that she taught me, and how do I continue to just really be truthful about where I'm at in my recovery?
Yeah. Oh, I absolutely love that. And listeners, I think what a beautiful message to remind ourselves, whether you are openly talking about being in the middle place, you're exploring this by listening to this podcast, you are doing a courageous thing also, because you're exploring and you're asking these questions and you're willing to sit in the discomfort. And that is really hard. And I am so grateful, Mallary, to you coming on this podcast, having this conversation. Listeners, like if any one of our episodes, remind yourself just to take one thing, one small thing. We don't need to conquer it all. We don't need to take everything she said. We don't need to buy the book today and read it all and put it into practice and suddenly master the middle place journey. We're just going 1% changes at a time. And of course, let us know in the comments what came up for you. If you have language that you use, things that you learned from this episode, ways that you want to see an evolution in the eating disorder or addiction field across the board, let us know. And of course, we'll see you back here next week.